All right. Welcome, everybody, to Finance Essentials with Danny Hudson. I am your wonderful host, Danny Hudson. And thank you guys for tuning in today. I apologize. I've been a little bit slow as far as releasing shows recently, but it's so good to be here and talking with you guys today. Just had a lot going on. You guys, as you guys are probably aware, life gets in the way, right? And trying to work and working on a new business idea, dog sitting and taking care of two small kids. There's just, what's the saying? There's just not enough hours in the day. But I appreciate you guys being here. I appreciate you guys tuning in. As always, follow us on social media. Hit that like, subscribe, share if you get some value out of the show, and you know that's how we'll keep the show going. So today I've got a special show. Well, let's be fair. They're all special, right? I put some work into it, do a little bit of research, learn a few things, teach you guys a few things, and they're all pretty special, right? Although if there are any unspecial ones, maybe I'll go back and I'll delete those, or I'll replace them with something a little bit better. But so I've got a great show. I think we're going to learn some things today. I know I did when I was starting to do some research, and again, we're going to continue on this this journey, right, where we're learning about large economic and business environmental situations and how they impact us on a regular basis. And I think that that's really important because, as we like to stress on the show, the value of knowing these types of things and then using it to our advantage to put ourselves in a better position. And so therefore we're able to help make those around us better and help elevate and build up the people around us and those that are in our community. And so before we dive into it, let's see some things that have been going on in the news, some important topics. Oh, I guess so recently the federal government decided that they're going to start sending people door to door as far as trying to get people vaccinated, which that'll be very interesting. I don't know how you guys are, but most people aren't very receptive to Jehovah's Witnesses and that kind of thing. So I don't know how receptive they're going to be to have people coming and knocking on people's doors. Because the thing that jumps out at my head when I think about that is that makes me believe that they have a list, right? They have a list of people who haven't been vaccinated, and that they will specifically target those people. So it's going to be very interesting to kind of see how this plays out, which states comply, which ones don't. But to be honest, though, I mean, do you guys want to be one of those people that are going door to door and just harassing people? I mean, that just sounds so awful. I mean, I would almost rather be a door to door salesman. I guess technically you're probably in that same vein of being a door-to-door salesman where but you're not selling somebody something that somebody might be able to use. What you're trying to do is you're trying to sell something to people who have access to this, essentially, quote unquote, for free, but they have willingly chose not to participate. And so, I mean, I don't know. That just sounds like such a terrible thing to do. And if you guys have had those folks that come around door to door and they're offering window replacements and things. Again, these are things that some people would actually use, and even those guys get rejected a ton. So I don't know how the reception of this is going to end up being. But so there's that going on. Let's see, the Tokyo Olympics, the 2020 Olympics are coming up, and they're not going to have any fans, I guess, watching. I read that they're actually not even going to allow other athletes on the team to show up to some of these events and allow them to watch. And to be completely honest, I'm just not that interested. I mean, I love the concept of the Olympics and watching the Olympics because it gives us the opportunity to watch events and sports and activities and things that you don't really get to see very often. How often do you really watch track and field? If you're like me, it's once every 4 years. But I'm just not really that interested in it this year. I just don't particularly care. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe the Olympics bug will bite me when we get a little bit closer. Let's see, anything else? Anything else crazy going on? Um, uh, you know what? Actually, there is something very important going on, and it relates to our prior guest, Mr. Scott Horton, that Biden has essentially pulled out of Afghanistan. Now, I am very critical of government, as I don't think many of you are surprised to hear. But I personally think that's great. I mean, I think credit should be given where credit is due, and I think that's great. And I think his press secretary, Psaki, she even said that they were looking at closing Guantanamo Bay, closing Gitmo, which that was an Obama campaign promise, and obviously he didn't follow through on it. But if they're able to close Gitmo, I mean, I think that's also tremendous. If you get the opportunity to, one of the episodes prior, I think it was titled, Andrew Yang said, "What we kind of go into the cost of the criminal system," and we touch on Gitmo a little bit. So if they're able to do that, I think that's really awesome. I think anybody deserves due process. And so if they're able to close down Gitmo, I think that'd be a tremendous win for them as well. But let's see. So diving into today's show, we're going to talk about a fascinating topic, which I know all of you are interested in, and we're going to talk about inflation. I know most of you are probably thinking, "Oh my God, come on!" But hey, give me the benefit of the doubt here, right? I mean, I tend to make this pretty interesting. I'm able to take some of these topics that normally would not be very interesting and kind of condense them down into an interesting discussion where you learn some things and you learn how it impacts you, and it helps you to be able to make better long-term decisions. And I mean, come on, what is this, episode 40? I mean, if you're new to the show, go back and listen to the other ones. But if you've been listening for a while, then you already know that it's gonna be pretty interesting. And we keep it relatively short. You know, a good crash course in inflation over the span of 30 to 40 minutes isn't so bad. So we're gonna talk about inflation. And again, if you are new to the show, this is going to be relative and related to, I guess not relative, but it is going to be related to some of the prior shows where we've talked about massive injections of capital into the economy, right? And as a result, here we are, right? Now we're going to be talking a little bit about inflation. But the primary reason, there's two main drivers that really drove me to make this episode. One of them was an article from CNBC where the headline on social media drove me crazy. I mean, it made me go insane, which is probably a problem, right? I probably shouldn't let stuff like that get to me, but whatever. Here we are. But it was from CNBC, and the title of it was "Inflation Silver Lining Higher Wages." And I read that, and I just thought, why? I mean, I get what you're trying to say, but why would you this is a solvable problem, right? I mean, you could fix inflation, but what they chose to do instead, and the article wasn't actually that bad, but what they chose to do instead is they tried to isolate out one small benefit that isn't related to anything else. Just because your wages go up doesn't mean things get better for you. But that's what they chose to isolate out, and so that's really what drove me. And the other piece of it was so there's a podcast that I listen to called The Political Gabfest, and the hosts are rather left, but I find that it's very valuable to understand the views and the perspectives of people who disagree with me on a fundamental level. Now, obviously, they're wrong, right? But it's important to know where a lot of these people are coming from. And so one of the hosts by the name of David Plotz talked about how he says that inflation is good. Now, I don't believe I'm taking this out of context. Maybe he meant this in another way. But he essentially said that inflation was good because wages would go up. And again, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, this is insane. The fact that there are people who believe in this and they're pushing this narrative that, oh, guess what, guys? Inflation isn't that bad. It literally drove me to want to make this episode. But I think a great quote and description of inflation is by the man, the myth, the legend, John Maynard Keynes, who, if you listen to this show and if you understand my position on a lot of this stuff, Keynes is probably one of the most negatively influential people in the history of the United States due to his monetary policy. But even when it came to inflation, he described inflation as a continuing process of inflation. Government can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. So essentially what he's saying, right, is that by inflating the currency up, you're going to confiscate secretly, right? Because most people don't think about it. It's just a part of life. Like, oh yeah, every year our value of our money gets 2% worse. That's just a part of life. They've managed to kind of make it a part of life. And so he talks about how the fact that is a major avenue to be able to confiscate the wealth of their citizens. So looking at the CNBC article, again, it was actually titled Inflation Silver Lining, Higher Wages. And so they talk about it, kind of some of the summaries. As inflation takes hold, that wages may also increase. But the question is, will it be enough to outpace the rise in prices? And I'm assuming that I'll pose that question to you guys, and I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Will wage increases be enough to outpace the rise in prices? Go ahead. I'll give you a few seconds. All right, time's up. No, the answer is no. The answer is no. It will not. It will not. And part of it is because, right, when you think about inflation, it just doesn't impact one thing, right? It might impact one thing if you are buying something direct. If you're buying something like a raw material, that doesn't work, because if you think about a raw material, it's not just the cost of the material itself, it's the labor to pick it, it's the distribution, it's the storage. So if your wages go up 2%, there's really nowhere that you could trace an item back to a specific period in the supply chain to where your wages would potentially compensate for the increase. Now, what you will find, and the reason why it sort of works out, is because, and we'll talk about some of these other side effects of inflation later, is that along the path of the supply chain, businesses are going to make strategic decisions, right? They're going to decide on whether or not they're going to increase prices, they're going to cut costs, whatever it might be. And so that's what they're referencing. But the truth is that there are side effects for all of this. And so what the answer in the long term is going to be no. And so they go on to say that as the economy picks up in the wake of COVID pandemic, concerns about inflation are gaining steam. And so there are going to be some prices on a lot of items that we're probably seeing already. The big one obviously is going to be cars. Most people, and we did an episode on lumber and some raw materials and things like that, but those prices are already coming back down due to some of the reasons that we discussed that actually drove the spike in pricing. But things like cars and vehicles are currently rising larger than expected and really helping to drive the inflation. But some of the stuff too that they're talking about it is groceries and energy costs, things along those lines. But also part of it though is, and which is their point, is that they say that consumers are paying more for everyday items, but that companies are facing a labor shortage, and so they're also paying more to get workers through the door, right? And so what they're basically saying is, and we've talked about this on a prior episode too, when we were talking about the enhanced unemployment benefits, but basically they're saying that companies are paying more to have people to come in the door because the labor pool overall is relatively short. And so they saw a paycheck bump in June and then in July. And so the average hourly earnings was about 0.3% over the month and about 3.6% year over year. And so the benefit of that is that if you are somebody like me who doesn't necessarily have an issue, jumping around from company to company, as long as I feel as though the company is taking care of me, then I'll take care of the company. And as we've talked about also in prior episodes, is you have that ability, right? You have a monopoly on your labor and the value of your labor. And so you have an obligation to source that out to get the best return that you possibly can on your labor, if you don't have your own business. Now, there are obviously trade-offs to that. If you work for a company that you like because they have good benefits and stuff, you may sacrifice some on the salary side. But they're basically saying that wages increased about 3.6% year over year, and that was according to the Labor Department. Now, incremental wages, though, are probably not going to be able to keep up with the cost of living. Again, right, we're talking about homes, we're talking about cars, we're talking about energy. We're literally talking about every single aspect of your life. And so, sure, if you are one of these people who does not have a problem kind of moving around from place to place, and you saw a 3.6% rise in salary year over year, then you're doing better than somebody who has been at a company for however many years, right? And you get that standard, cost of living increase, to your salary every year, where they just throw you a bone and give you a 2 or a 3% or whatever it might be. That's like your cost of living adjustment. Now, if you continue to take that, you will lose. You most likely are probably taking a pay cut every single year, and you don't even know it. And so if you don't bump up to the next level as far as salary bands or position or whatever it might be, or bounce around to another company that's willing to offer you more, then there is a good chance that when it comes to real wages, you're taking a hit. So we've been talking about this inflation, and I thought it was very valuable to kind of define. Here we are, 15 minutes in, and I'm defining now what inflation is. But inflation is essentially defined as a persistent increase in the level of consumer prices or a persistent decline in the purchasing power of money. So the easiest way to describe this and define this is that as the Fed continues to print money, again, as we've discussed, right, $6 to $8 trillion over the past year and a half has been printed, and it's been more than that, right? It's more than that, but that was kind of in direct stimulus, is like $6 to $8 trillion. And so how that relates to inflation is that as that money is being printed, you're increasing the monetary supply. Now, if you happen to have been the lucky individual, and this is a hypothetical scenario here, if you were the lucky individual where the government prints $6 trillion and they managed to give you $6 trillion in cash, and you just bury it all in your backyard, that won't necessarily increase inflation, right? That won't drive inflation because that money is not in circulation. So they could print money forever, right, to infinite, but until it reaches circulation, it's not necessarily going to cause inflation. And so that's what the part about the purchasing power of money is because as that money hits circulation, the speed in which it changes hands is what drives inflation. And so an increase in monetary supply, and then the increased circulation, the changing hand to hand of that money is what is going to create the inflation. And it really reminds me of a quote from Henry Hazlitt, who is the author of Economics in One Lesson, where he says that inflation is a form of tax, a tax that we all collectively must pay. And unfortunately, we don't. Well, I take that back, because with the introduction of Bitcoin and other potential competing currencies, maybe. But what he's saying, right, is that unfortunately, if we participate in this monetary supply, this is a tax that we all will face. And so where a lot of this is coming from is recently, if you guys have been paying attention to the inflation numbers, is that in June, right? As the how it's described as the economic recovery continues is that inflation is continuing to accelerate. And the biggest categories were in areas like we've already discussed in vehicles, but also in airlines and in clothes. So think retail. And so June was actually the fastest pace in about 13 years. So in June, about a 5.4% consumer price index year over year, which is the highest since about 2008. And I'm sure we all know kind of what happened around around 2008. Now the core price index, which excludes food and energy, rose about 4.5%. Now the reason why they take food and energy out of the core price index is because it tends to fluctuate a little bit more, right? If you guys are very familiar with farms and food supplies, you always read about, oh, well, this area is in a drought and this place is in a flood and this one has bugs and whatever. And so the food sector tends to fluctuate. And then if you think about energy, right, we had the situation in the winter in Texas, which spiked prices, and then we also have areas where it's super hot, like the way that the Northwest was going on a few weeks ago, where they were getting super high temperatures. Air conditioners drive energy prices, energy demand, and so that will also fluctuate. So the core price index, which excludes those, rose about 4.5%. So the CPI is going to measure the consumer, what we pay for goods and services, and then that includes all of it, and then that also includes vehicles, which we talked about before, which was actually up about 10% year over year, which is very interesting because we had a vehicle that got totaled. I guess it was probably about a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, and so we got a check, right, for the estimated value because we had, was it gap insurance or whatever. Well, about a month ago, we actually received another check from the insurance company that basically said, hey, due to estimated values of your vehicle, here's extra money due to miscalculations. My guess is that audit probably went through there and they said, hey, you know what, this number actually doesn't tie out to this number, so you have to compensate them. I don't know if my guess is it's legal related, because I can't think of any company that would be willing to mail you a check for a totaled vehicle and then mail you another one later on and go, hey, we kind of screwed up here, unless there was potential negative implications. But hey, who's going to turn down free money? But it was pretty considerable versus the value of the vehicle that we got at the time. And so that, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that those used car prices have continued to increase. Now, part of the other issue that I have with this whole current take on inflation, right? Because if you think about it, a lot of people need to be pushing the narrative that inflation isn't bad, right? Because we're printing up trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And so in an effort to maintain this current environment that we're in, with the US dollar being the reserve currency in the world, people still having faith in the dollar, it's very necessary to maintain that system by being able to push that, hey, you know what? It's the dollar, right? You can have faith in the dollar. Nothing bad is going to happen to it. And so, of course, the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, boo, boo. Sorry, that's a little immature. But Jerome Powell, as of June, was coming out and basically saying that, hey, you know what? Inflation is just transitory, which is essentially saying that, hey, don't worry about this. Inflation is just temporary. And then they start going into a list of things that they were saying about, why it's transitory. They were basically saying it's bottlenecks and supply chains. And so if you've looked at the cost of renting container ships, you've looked at delays at ports of entry, and so you're seeing a lot of spikes in those types of activities and those types of products that is helping to drive prices down the supply chain. But another thing too is that we're also comparing year over year, and so if you're thinking about, April, May, June of last year, everybody was inside. Nobody was really leaving their homes. Unfortunately, people still aren't leaving their homes in some places. But prices ended up dropping last year, and so he's basically saying, well, because of the supply chain bottlenecks and because of prices from last year, we're seeing a higher temporary increase in inflation. Now, it's twofold, right? Is that, for one, he has a message that he has to protect, right? He has to basically say that, hey, this monetary policy that we've been executing on for the last year and a half hasn't created significant problems, because the way that works, right, is that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if he comes out and he's like, oh boy, man, we really screwed up. Inflation's in a lot of trouble right now. Everyone's going to go, oh man, the Fed chair is basically saying that we're all screwed. So he to continue the narrative, he can't say that. But what it also does is it also makes him a liar. And Jerome Powell, if you're listening right now, you are a liar. Now, it might not necessarily stay that high, right? It might not necessarily stay, according to how they calculate it, at that 4 or 5% range. But inflation is absolutely a problem, and more channels and avenues and media outlets are picking up on it, and they're starting to basically say, well, we don't think that this is as transitory as you thought. And so, for example, one of those was Aneta Markowska, and who's the chief economist at Jefferies, and she noted that core inflation, which does, like we talked about earlier, excludes out food and energy, and it has now exceeded 0.7% for 3 consecutive months, and it's actually averaged since April about 0.84%. And so if you think about that on an annualized basis, you're talking about approximately 10%. So you're talking about approximately 10% inflation for the year. Now, if you didn't get a 10.1% or a 10% raise year over year, guess what? You took a pay cut. You know who else took a pay cut? This guy. This guy took a pay cut. Regarding, if we're going to compare it to inflation, this guy took a pay cut. And guess what? I'm not happy about it. You know why? Because I think I do a pretty damn good job at my job. And so I don't want to make less money, and it's kind of out of my control. Well, that's not necessarily true, because I could always leave. I could leave if I really wanted to. And maybe I will. If we get 10% more inflation next year, and they give me another 2 or 3% raise, maybe I will. I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I'm losing money. But that is a very important fact, is that there are very few people in this country who are going to make more than 10% this year than they did last year. Now, as we like to talk about on this show, right, is how does that affect you? Who stands to take advantage of this? Who is the group of people who come out on the positive end? And if you listen to last week's show, guess who the answer is? Rich people. Rich people, again, have an advantage due to government policy to be able to increase their wealth at a rate that would exceed inflation, and again, due to government policy. And you're probably thinking, well, how do they do that? Isn't that what Keynes said, that and Henry Hazlitt said, that inflation kind of impacts everybody? The answer is yes, but as the case with just about every government policy, it hurts the middle class and the poor more than the rich people. And part of that is because the rich people are the ones who typically tend to have assets, right? They have appreciating assets, and they control and they own things that typically tend to increase in value relative to the rate of inflation. So think real estate, think precious metals, think land, property, things along those lines. Classic cars, right? They're not buying a 10-year-old beater car that they can drive from point A to point B. Of course not. What they're doing, what are they buying? They're buying 1960s Ferraris, things that have appreciated tenfold over the past several decades. That's the type of stuff that they're buying, and they also own stocks, right? They own investments in companies that have continued to be propped up by this ridiculous printing spree. But guess who doesn't, right? A lot of people like us, the poor and the middle class people, who are the ones who, hey, our car is breaking down, we need to go buy a new vehicle, or at least a new used vehicle. Well, guess who's the one that has to be concerned about the fact that 10% higher price on a vehicle versus last year means that we might have to pay an extra 2 or 3 grand versus just a year ago? Poor middle class people, right? And so once again, this policy of inflation will continue to be a tax on the poor and the middle class. So think about people that are on fixed incomes, right? Those guys, they're not going to get a 10% bump in their Social Security. I mean, they might get something, right? But there's no way that I'm sure they're going to calculate out, oh, well, you get a 4% increase due to whatever conditions. Oh, we excluded this and we excluded that. Because they're not going to come out and they're not going to, if you were on fixed income, you will never make more money the following year than the previous year. I'll just say that right now. It's just not going to happen. It's never going to happen because that's not the way that the system is designed. It's just not going to happen. And so that is one big way that it impacts you. Another one of the I think it's probably more of a myth, is that a lot of people will say, well, what it's going to do is it's going to diminish the incentive to save, right? Because if you put money in a savings account and it's earning 1.5%, because think that the fact that the federal interest rate is essentially zero, so even high yield savings accounts are paying you at, I don't know, 1.2%, 1.3%, and we're talking about potential double-digit inflation. And so the incentive there is why am I holding this money in the bank? I'm going to go out and spend it. And so there is a myth that many people believe and they buy into that says that consumer spending is what drives an economy. And it's just not true. It's just not true. Because the reason why that spending does not drive an economy is because you can't spend to create value, right? What people are going to say is that, well, we're going to spend money over here and it's going to increase the demand, and then therefore the supply will, they'll say, oh, well, there's demand for this, so we need to increase the supply of this. Well, that's not the way it works, because the demand could always be temporary, right? And it takes additional capital to be able to raise production, like we talked about with the lumber prices. A lot of companies and a lot of mills, right, they don't want to just increase, they don't want to spend tens of millions of dollars increasing their production when long term they don't think that the demand is sustainable. And so the idea that consumer spending is what's going to be driving an economy is ludicrous. What it does do, though, is it disincentivizes saving and it incentivizes spending. And so then you become a consumerist economy, and you don't become a saving and investing economy. So there are some ways, again, similar to that this inflation would impact you. A big one is it's going to erode purchasing power, right? Your dollar is worth less today than it was a year ago. And again, like we just talked about, it encourages spending rather than saving. Now, it will encourage investing in the sense that, and as we've talked about prior shows, where people have to find a return on their money, right? A high yield savings account is no longer that avenue. What they need to do is they need to invest in riskier and riskier avenues to be able to get a return, so that way they are not losing versus the inflation. One of the things it also does is like we talked about, it hurts low income and fixed income. Because think about rents, right? Rents are going to go up, mortgages are going to go up. All of these things are going to go up generally higher than the wage increases. And again, we've talked about the wealthy that also have the advantages that they do against inflation, which if you have listened to multiple episodes, if you haven't listened to multiple episodes, go back and check it out. But a lot of times when the government does implement these types of policies, that is the group who typically tends to stand out in regards to putting themselves in a better position. But another big one that a lot of people don't think about, or maybe you do think about, but it just doesn't really register, is things like shrinkflation. Now, if you're not familiar with shrinkflation, think about when you go out and you buy a bag of chips. You know, you're going out and you're like, hey, I want some Cool Ranch Doritos. I mean, personally, I think if you like Cool Ranch Doritos over nacho cheese Doritos, then maybe we can't be friends. But we'll just use Cool Ranch Doritos for this example. But you go out and you buy a bag of Cool Ranch Doritos and you put in your cart and you kind of pick the bag up and you're like, wow, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of chips in here. You know, what is going on? The bag doesn't seem smaller, but it seems lighter than it used to be. Well, the answer is that because it did. It used to be, it used to have more chips in there. And that's what's essentially called shrinkflation. So as we were talking earlier about supply chains and we talked about removing costs out of products, that's one of them. So your bag of Doritos, again, the bag size might not change, but the contents does. And so what they might say is they might say, oh, well, 2 years ago, a bag of family-sized Doritos had 34 ounces in it. Well, now that family-sized bag of Doritos has 29.6 ounces in it, right? Because that is their way of saying, well, we can't increase the price, so we have to find other ways of being able to save money. And some of them are very creative. When I was reading about some of these, for example, candy bars, right? I can't remember the brand. Maybe one of you guys will know. But what they did was, instead of having kind of like one large candy bar, they had two smaller ones. And so what that does is right, it creates more space in the bag by not having one, and then instead of having kind of squared edges, they round them, which is genius. Whoever was at that company and was like, boom, rounded edges, let's do it, and they're gonna go, wow, you just helped us save, I don't know, $30 million this year, or whatever it might be, by rounding these edges. But these are the types of things that companies will have to do in environments like this, where they are afraid to increase prices, or they have pressure to keep prices the same. They will find other ways. Another thing, obviously, is decreased quality of ingredients. For example, I guess this was probably about a year ago or so. We went to Costco and I bought the box of cereal that has Count Chocula and Boo Berry and Frankenberry. The children's cereal that has the marshmallows and stuff in it, and you eat it, and the rice pieces, they were awful, they were terrible, and so I remember being as a kid, you got to drink like the chocolate milk and stuff like that after you finished, and now it's just like this grainy cardboard knockoff chocolate kind of taste and flavor to it. And the reason for that is because they have had to decrease the quality of the ingredients to help maintain a specific price point, so that way people continue to buy it. And so they will sacrifice quality to help maintain and keep their sales. And so that's another way that we will all suffer through inflation. But I hope that this was able to help teach you guys a little bit of how inflation impacts you, how the narrative of inflation is trying to be pushed, and why it's important for you to understand the consequences of these types of policies, and how it can impact you, and how it can impact your community and your family, and hopefully help you think about ways, hey, what can I do to help avoid this, or what can I do in my personal life to be able to put myself in a position where I won't be as negatively impacted by these types of policies than I would otherwise. But hopefully you learned something today. I had a great time doing it. It's always fun getting to learn some things and teach those things to you guys. And if you have any questions, or if you have any feedback, by all means, feel free to let me know. But share and like the show if you got something good out of it, and we'll talk to you again soon. All right, bye.